On our last television program, we began a study in the book of Genesis, showing that the book is a topical index for the entire Bible. We went through the first 9 chapters of Genesis and showed how they were literally topical overviews of the first 9 books of the Bible. If you didn't catch that program, all I can say is get the tape. On today's program, we shall have to begin with Genesis chapter 10 and continue this incredible study in Genesis, a topical index of the Bible. Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me.
And J.R., it almost sounds too good to be true, namely that there are recurrent themes in the Bible that can be tracked and traced, and yet it's so obvious once you begin to study it. For example, we come to the 10th division of Genesis now, chapter 10, and we have genealogies here. We have Japheth and Ham and Canaan and Shem. And Shem, of course, is the genealogy that leads right down to Abraham. It's the divine genealogy, if you will. Out of this house will come the Lord, the Messiah. And it's interesting that chapter 10 speaks then of the redemption in terms of the divine genealogy. And we have yet another divine genealogy in the corresponding 10th division of the Old Testament, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And in fact, what we have when you begin to read 1st Chronicles, you just read right off the bat, cold, not even a definite article or anything. Adam, Sheth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, and so forth, right down through Methuselah and on.
Through Noah and Shem and so on.
And you have the same genealogy.
So what we've got is the genealogy of Shem through Noah and Shem and so on. But then in First Chronicles, we have that royal lineage brought all the way down through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and the 12 tribes.
Yeah.
This is what we have in the Chronicles.
And it's fascinating that we're dealing here with divinity. Now, in this division, which we have taken, by the way, from the 22 divisions of the Hebrew alphabet, which we've discovered runs all the way through the design of the Old Testament, this would be the 10th division. The symbol of that is the letter Yud. The 10th letter of the Hebrew alphabet has a value of 10, and it symbolizes the divine name, divinity, the course of the divine. And it's kind of fascinating that all of the interesting divine names of the Old Testament begin with this letter. For example, Yahweh begins with the letter Yod. Yisrael, Israel, begins with the letter Yod. Yerushalayim, Jerusalem, begins with Yod. Jacob, Yaakov, begins with a Yod. All of the important names that you run into in the Old Testament begin with that letter Yod, which is the course of divinity, the divine name, the divine plan.
So you can see that this 10th chapter of Genesis is actually a topical index of what we see continuing then in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. We come to the 11th chapter of Genesis and we see a Tower of Babel built, man's accomplishment, his crowning accomplishment, but judged by God. And so God confounds the language and scatters them throughout the world. Its corresponding book, Gary, is Ezra and Nehemiah. That seems to fit the same theme as is given here in Genesis chapter 11.
Well, you know, when you come to Genesis chapter 11, you have a very strange chapter that contains 2 thoughts. The first thought being the Tower of Babel. The second thought is the call of Abraham. Tower of Babel, we all know what happened to it. It was judged. The people were dispersed. It came to nothing. But it was replaced by a plan from God, the family lineage of Abram and the call of Abram out of the very same land where the tower had been built and where it collapsed. Out of that land came a man with a plan.
And in Ezra and Nehemiah, out of that same land comes a man with a plan, this time not to build a temple of idolatry, such as the Tower of Babel, but to rebuild the true temple, the temple to God in Jerusalem.
Oh, and it's so fascinating because when you get to Ezra, you have the call to rebuild the temple, and you have a divine or sacred genealogy and talking about the people who would be coming back to the land. And you get into Nehemiah, and by the way, these books were originally called 1st and 2nd Ezra. They were combined as one book. And Ezra and Nehemiah talk about the call of the people out of Babylon by genealogical line and the building of the temple and of the wall surrounding the temple. Well, J.R., You have a divine genealogy in Genesis 11, which is also an 11th division. This being, shall we say, filed under the Hebrew letter Kaf, which symbolizes crowning accomplishment.
There are some comparisons between the events in Genesis 11 and the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. For example, at the Tower of Babel, men's languages were changed. We learn in Nehemiah chapter 13 and verse 24, that the people returning from Babylon could not speak the Jews' language, but according to the language of each people. So we have another language problem here, don't we, Gary?
We do indeed, and this time, of course, it has to do with the Hebrew language and the restoration, I should say, of the Hebrew language after captivity.
In Genesis chapter 11, we have the people scattered so that they might separate themselves from each other. And in Ezra and Nehemiah, we have the same people separating themselves from the people of the land. In fact, men who had foreign wives had to divorce them. That sounds rather harsh, but it was a crowning accomplishment, a monumental task, so to speak. God demanded it, they had to do it.
And what we're pointing out here is that each chapter of Genesis, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, outlines corresponding division in the Old Testament. Genesis being division 1, Exodus division 2, Leviticus division 3, and so forth. We show that there is an outline in Genesis that outlines the original layout of the Old Testament. It's a phenomenal idea. It is loaded with meaning, with prophetic weight. It enables you to go to various parts of the Old Testament and see divine inspiration. The hand of God is all over the Old Testament. It is not the work of primitive tribal peoples at all. This is the work of the hand of God.
In Genesis chapter 12, we have Abraham and his wife Sarah moving down into Egypt, and Sarah becomes the woman who was attracted to Pharaoh. And so Pharaoh takes her into his palace, hoping to marry her, with plans to marry Sarah. Well, this being the 12th chapter, we look at the 12th book of the Old Testament. It has the same story in it, Gary.
It does. We have in the 12th division of the Old Testament the book of Esther, and we have here the story of Esther in the foreign court of Ahasuerus, just as Sarai, Abram's wife, was in the court of Pharaoh. Now, it's the same theme, and by the way, each of these stories teaches us a slightly different lesson. These are variations on a theme of a woman in a foreign court, shall we say. And Sarai's lesson is that the royal lineage, that would be Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so forth, could not be disturbed by the decree of God. God would not allow that to be tampered with. Then the lesson that we get in Esther is that it will not do to try to destroy the Jews by making anti-Semitism the law of the land. So in both cases, we are taught a graphic lesson.
In Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, we have these words. God said, "And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee." And in the book of Esther, we find that comes to pass. Haman learns that bitter lesson, doesn't he?
Yeah, curse for curse in kind. In other words, not only will I curse you, but I will curse you in the very same way you attempted to curse my people. And of course, Haman wanted to hang Mordecai, and it ended up that Haman was the one who was strung up on the public gallows.
Yeah. Now we come to Genesis chapter 13, and we find Abraham is a rich man. He is rich with cattle and goods, and he goes through a difficulty, a problem with Lot. And in the 13th book of the Old Testament, the book of Job, we have a similar overriding theme. Job is a rich man, isn't he?
Yeah, Job is a wealthy man, and by the way, he's called a righteous man. And we have this very interesting scene at the very opening of the book of Job in which Satan comes before the throne of God and mentions Job and says, you know, Job, if you allowed me to tempt Job, a righteous man, I believe he would turn away from you. And God said, all right, I'll allow you to test Job. Well, J.R., what we have here is that Job loses all of his wealth, and you know the story. It's restored to him in the end, in fact, several-fold. but there's this enormous anguish, wealth, and power falling and collapsing, and Job's struggling through it all. Well, we have the division between Abram and Lot. In the 13th division of Genesis, chapter 13, Abram and Lot separate. And Abram says, Lot, you go ahead and take whatever land you want. Lot says, I'm going to take that good land down there by Sodom. And he goes and lives down there. And in chapter 13, verse 13, we read, but the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. Yeah. And so he went and fell, shall we say, in Sodom, but God promised Abram all the land that he could see with his eyes. So here we have, again, a story, if you will, a commentary in both cases on wealth and power and corruption.
And losing it and then gaining it all back again.
Right.
Just as in Genesis 13, God, after the rift comes and goes, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, Abram, I'll give you everything you see, north, east, south, and west. And that's basically what he did to Job as well. Job was given this grand opportunity to recover everything that he had lost. To continue with our study in the chapters of Genesis, and each as an overview of an Old Testament book, we look at chapter 14 and the delivering of Lot. Lot is actually taken captive by the kings of the east, and Abram delivers him. He takes his trained soldiers and goes and delivers Lot. This, I think we can see here the downfall of Lot in this 14th chapter. And it corresponds very nicely with the Psalms, doesn't it?
It does. The 14th division in both cases symbolized by the Hebrew letter Nun, the 14th letter. And what we have here is Lot's downfall and rescue. After he chose to live in Sodom, he was besieged by kings who wanted to overthrow him, take his lands and good, had to be rescued by Abram. Now, what's interesting about this, JR, is that Lot becomes a figure of conflict. He is down here he's called righteous Lot, and yet he is besieged. He's made a bad decision. He's gotten himself in trouble. He's besieged by people who want to kill him, and he becomes the figure, an archetype, if you will, for David, who is pursued by Saul. And the subject of that pursuit and that spiritual struggle is embodied in the Psalms. And David, of course, becomes a figure for the house of David, Israel.
It's amazing to me that this 14th chapter of Genesis is an overview of the 14th book of the Bible, the Psalms. Listen to Genesis 14:18. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was priest of the Most High God. Guess what book of the Bible Melchizedek is next mentioned in? The Psalms. That's amazing, isn't it?
Oh, it really is amazing, because we have in Psalm 110:4, the Lord hath sworn, will not repent, thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. We have then the Messianic line, the house of David in conflict, and we have the final, shall we say, spiritual revival of the house of David, the high priesthood of the order of Melchizedek, the coming Messiah. These are all themes that were first introduced in the 14th chapter of Genesis.
Yeah. The 15th chapter of Genesis sees a special Abrahamic covenant, as God says to Abraham, He brought him forth abroad and said, Look now toward the heaven and tell the stars, if thou be able to number them. And he said unto him, So shall thy seed be. Here are the signs, the samanim, so to speak. And this is what we see in Proverbs as well, isn't it?
That's right. Shall we say, the index mark of chapter 15 of Genesis is the Samic. And that is the 15th letter of the alphabet, and it stands for signs, for memory aids, and for proverbs, by the way. And we have here the remembrance. We have a mention of the heavenly bodies. We have, and in Proverbs, by the way, we come to the key to Proverbs in Proverbs 1:6. To understand a proverb and the interpretation, the words of the wise and their dark sayings. The Proverbs, then, are words of wisdom couched in extremely deep and weighty language, difficult to be understood. And we have I guess the mandate in the Bible is to learn and to remember these proverbs. Likewise, here in chapter 15, J.R., we have the beginning of something that is extremely deep, extremely spiritually weighty, and it has to do with the covenant of Abraham being signed, sealed, and delivered.
In the 16th chapter of this book of Genesis, we have what I think is rather fascinating. We have the story of the birth of Ishmael, but we have throughout this chapter the ayin, the eye, for sight and insight. And so the insight that we see here in Genesis chapter 16 is the overriding principle, the overriding theme. We can see this in this same insight, or the lack thereof, in this 16th book of the Old Testament.
16th book of the Old Testament, and the sign here, or the letter, is ayin, the symbol of the eye, signifying sight and insight. And you know, the thing that typifies this chapter, J.R., chapter 16, is the carnal plan to have children, where faith broke, and Sarai suggested to Abram that she go into her mistress to produce an heir. And the mistress ends up bearing a child and running off into the wilderness to a place where she has a conversation with God. And she called the name of the Lord that spoke to her in verse 13 and said, "Thou, God, seest me." And she named the place where she had this conversation Be'er Lahai, which means the living one who sees me. That's the sight of God. And here, this is the exact topic of this particular category. Now, as you go to the same division of the Old Testament, the 16th division of the Old Testament, this brings us to the book of Ecclesiastes. And by the way, this is an amazing book because the very topic of this book, from one end to the other, is sight and insight. That is a view of life under the sun.
Now, you know, Abraham bore Ishmael, which was not in the plan of God. This was men's way of doing what God wanted. Don't we see men's wisdom in Ecclesiastes as opposed to God's wisdom here?
Oh, yeah, we do indeed. We see man in vanity and fatigue. And what's the use of, I mean, it's all going to turn to dust anyway. And the human view of things is so dark and so dead, and that's exactly what we have here. And the insights of the worldly man are the subject of Ecclesiastes.
Amazing. Genesis chapter 17 is representative of mouth and speech, and being the Peh chapter. It's interesting that God is revealed as El Shaddai, as the Almighty God. In fact, in verse 1 he says to Abram, I am the Almighty God, El Shaddai. And we can see this, I think, an overview in the Song of Solomon. Gary?
Peh, the letter P, as it comes down to us in English, in Hebrew, Peh, the 17th division, symbolizing the mouth and speech. And it's fascinating that this brings us to the Song of Solomon, which, by the way, is a statement about the relationship between God and man on an extremely deep spiritual level. And it begins in chapter 1, the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for thy love is better than wine. And what we have here then is the relationship between God and the beloved, couched in the relationship between a man and a woman. Well, this very same subject, by the way, is mentioned in the 17th chapter of Genesis, because we have Abram's name being changed to Abraham, Sarai's name being changed to Sarah. And we have then the marital relationship, the preparation of a bride and groom to produce the royal lineage.
Incredible. I've written in our magazine, our July edition of our magazine, and I said, the Song of Solomon deals with a subject not discussed in polite society. The Jews forbid its reading to the young and unmarried. Not that the subject is vulgar, but sensitive. And in the Hebrew language, the subject of the human anatomy is even more explicit than our English translation. The spiritual significance of Genesis 17 and the Song of Solomon is, for all practical purposes, beyond human comprehension. It is too intimate for speculation. Suffice it to say that Genesis 17 sets the guidelines for the Song of Solomon. For in Genesis 17, we have the covenant of circumcision. Now we get to Genesis chapter 18, the Tzadi, the righteous, and it appears to be an overview of Isaiah.
And by the way, when it comes to this letter, which is the 18th division of Genesis, chapter 18, Tzadi, reminds us of the Hebrew word tzaddik, the righteous one. And here is a test of faith. As a matter of fact, Sarah's faith is tested in this chapter. And 3 men appear to Abram, and we have here a divine appearance in the Old Testament. And we have a, shall we say, a test of righteousness in the royal family. Well, Isaiah has the very, very same theme, serving King Hezekiah the way he does, and forecasting a test in the royal family, the household of the royal lineage. Is
amazing.
Basic, but the same basic theme.
You remember in this chapter, Abraham says, look, if I could find 50 righteous, would you spare? Well, how about 45, 40, 30, 20, 10? Isaiah chapter 1 says, except the Lord of hosts had left unto us a very small remnant, we should have been like unto Sodom, and we should have been like unto Gomorrah. Same theme. That is, this chapter literally gives us an overview of that particular book. The number of the chapter, the number of the book.
Number of the chapter, number of the book, and we're talking then about divisions of Genesis corresponding to divisions of the Old Testament.
Yeah, this 18th division, 18th chapter.
18th chapter, right.
That's incredible. I wish we had time to go through the remaining chapters. I don't know exactly what we shall do about that, whether we shall continue on our next program. I suspect that we will, but this to me is one of the most exciting developments or discoveries, I guess I could say, that we've made in a long time, isn't it?
Well, J.R., what it suggests is an amazing thing, that the Bible was divinely inspired.
Yeah. This is J.R. Church and Gary Stearman. Until next time, keep looking up.